Hello. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is jointly hosted by BoardSource and the Center for Effective Philanthropy. We're so glad you've joined us today. I'd like to introduce to you our panelists for today. Today we have Ann Wallestad, President and CEO of BoardSource, Ivy Allen, President of Foundation for the Mid-South, Don Chen, President of the Surdna Foundation, and Naomi Orenstein, Director of Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Naomi now.
Thanks, Grace. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to share the high-level findings from CEP's recently released report, which will then inform a great discussion that we're going to have today with Ann, Ivy, and Don. So there's a lot more covered in the full report, including great resources from other organizations and discussion questions for foundation staff and boards. This and all of our research is available for free download on our website at cep.org. And I also want to put in a plug for a funder Q&A blog series that went live today on CEP's blog. A group of 13 funders shared their perspectives on why their foundations are engaging in the policy realm. There's great richness in their responses, and I encourage you to check it out and sign up to receive CEP's blog. So, the nonprofit and the philanthropic sector, of course, have contributed to many advances in our society. And many of these efforts, often led by nonprofit organizations, have been supported by foundations engaging in policy. And though the critique of philanthropic policy influence isn't new, criticisms have intensified in recent years. At the same time, though, it's also so clear that the problems we're facing right now, from public health to inclusive economies, inequality writ large, and racism, are structural and require policy solutions. Yet, for all the conversation and critique about foundations engaging in the policy realm, there's limited sector-wide data about foundation practices, and that's why we wanted to pursue a study on this topic. We're grateful for the funding that we received for this project from these 7 foundations, and as we built out this study, we sought to build on other efforts and answer these key questions. What are foundation leaders' perspectives on foundation efforts to influence policy in the US? To what extent are foundations trying to influence public policy? How effective do foundation leaders believe their policy efforts are? And what are the challenges that foundations face in this work, as well as the successes that they experience? And when we talk about what it means to influence policy, we mean influencing government priorities. This can be through grant making, collaboration, or direct action. And there's so many activities that are in the policy toolbox too, ways for funders to directly or indirectly educate, influence, or mobilize others. So just as some examples, funders can support things like research, organizing, movement building, policy analysis, media outreach, and relationships with officials. So when we talk about what it means to influence policy today, what I mean is this broad range of activities. I do want to touch on methodology. We surveyed and conducted in-depth interviews with leaders of private and community foundations across the country. We also surveyed leaders of nonprofit organizations. The response rates that we received are in line with what is typical, 38% from foundation leaders and 35% from nonprofit leaders. I do want to be really open and transparent that there's likely some degree of response bias in the data that we collected from foundation CEOs. We tried to hear both from foundations that do and don't engage in policy. So ultimately, most respondents indicate that they do engage in the policy realm. Ultimately, though, we heard from more than 200 foundation leaders, so a pretty good-sized group of funders. I also want to note that we saw very few differences by foundation size or geographic area. And similarly, this is interesting, even though community and private foundations are subject to different rules in the policy arena, we also saw very few differences between community and private foundations. So all of that to say that I'm going to focus on the overall aggregate level data. So let's dig in. Here are our 3 main findings. First, most foundation leaders view efforts to influence policy as an important way to achieve their goals. These efforts aren't new, but have increased in recent years, yet remains a small portion of most foundations' work. Our second finding is that foundation leaders recognize they can't achieve their policy goals alone. Most are supporting grantees' policy efforts and collaborating with others. Third, most foundations have had mixed success in their policy efforts, or are unsure how effective their efforts have been. Foundation leaders also face some common challenges, particularly when it comes to building board support, which we're particularly interested in digging into with all of you today. Let's start by breaking down into finding one. Foundation leaders see a crucial role for philanthropy in influencing public policy. 90% of those we surveyed seek to influence public policy. And foundation leaders overwhelmingly describe policy influence as an important philanthropic tool that can further their goals as a high-value way for them to have impact. They also describe policy as a way to ensure more effective grant-making and a better environment for their grantees. And the importance of policy comes through in open-ended responses to the survey and interviews. Leaders say things like this, the quote you see here up on the screen. If foundations do not seek to influence public policy that furthers the goals of their grant-making, they're undermining their own work. This is one of many representative comments underscoring the importance of policy engagement. And particularly relevant to the current moment, foundation leaders also see policy as key for systems change. They describe the unique opportunity for foundations to create change, and some report a moral imperative for funders to engage in policy. And that certainly comes through loud and clear in these two comments. Grant making alone cannot fix the injustices that have been perpetrated through public policy. And another adding that the scales of influence in our democracy are not balanced. Our role is to lift up voices that are often ignored. Engaging in policy is not a new practice for most funders in our study. Most have been engaged in the policy realm for a decade or more. Nearly 3/4 of leaders we surveyed, though, have increased their own foundation's policy efforts over the past few years. And as you can see here in this chart, these increased efforts are most frequently at the state and local level. Yet, even as foundations describe doing more policy work, they also report that policy is overall a small component of their efforts in terms of dollars, grants, and time. This is certainly something that I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on, Ivy and Don. Turning to our second finding, that foundation leaders recognize they can't achieve their policy goals alone. The primary way in which foundations are working through their policy agenda is grant making. Almost 3/4 of foundations that engage in policy support the efforts of their grantees. And in comments, they emphasize the importance of doing this work in partnership with grantees. They underscore the expertise that nonprofit leaders have in policy, and that comes through in this quote here. One leader says that your grantees can probably do this work better than you. Foundation leaders in our study support a broad range of grantees' policy activities. So just to give you a sense, more than 90% of those that we surveyed are supporting grantees' efforts to do the things that you see up here on the screen, like helping their grantees collaborate, educating the public, organizing policy analysis, and media outreach. I mentioned earlier that we also surveyed nonprofit leaders through our nationally representative grantee voice panel for the study. We asked nonprofit leaders for their suggestions for how funders can better support their policy work. And most frequently, they say and request that their funders just be willing to fund more of their existing policy work. And they request grants that are more flexible, grants that reflect an understanding that policy change is complex and doesn't happen quickly. And you can see that come through here in these quotes on the screen. Almost 90% of foundation leaders are part of collaborative efforts to influence policy. In fact, among those that are engaging in the policy realm, working with others is the top piece of advice that they would share with a funder considering this work. In comments, leaders describe the value and importance of collaboration in policy work. They describe how it can enhance impact, build alignment, leverage resources, and build broad support. None of us can solve these problems alone, says one foundation leader. I want to turn now to our third finding, that most foundation leaders report mixed success in their policy work and face some common challenges. So when it comes to assessing their foundation's policy efforts, half of those that we interviewed think that on the whole, they've had pretty mixed success. Many of them emphasize the inherent challenges of policy work, the inevitability of some degree of failure. Some describe the nonlinear, long-term nature of creating durable policy change. A good number also emphasize the importance of assessing policy work in terms of contribution, not attribution. And that really comes through in this comment. One leader describes how this work is hard. It can be wearing, success is unpredictable, and the lesson is to keep doing it and try harder. Foundation leaders we interviewed haven't really experienced negative consequences from their policy engagement, but they do face some common challenges in their policy work, most frequently building board support. This is likely what brought many of you to today's webinar, so I really want to dig into some of these data points to tee up the conversation that we're going to be having. So as you can see here in this chart, less than half of foundation leaders say that their board is completely supportive of the foundation's efforts to influence policy. Some leaders describe boards as wary broadly of policy engagement, as fearful of becoming political, as concerned about making policy missteps, or more generally, having a risk-averse stance. And that comes through in this comment here. Our board is afraid of the word advocacy, says one foundation leader. Other foundation leaders also reference challenges of educating and engaging the board, making the connection to their board from the policy implications that connect to their grant-making goals. Further complicating matters, there's a bit of a gap when it comes to perceptions of understanding what policy activities are legally permissible. Nearly 3/4 of leaders self-report having a strong understanding of legally permissible policy activities. But as you can see here in the chart that I just circled, fewer than one third of leaders believe that their boards understand very well what policy-related activities are legally permissible. So that's a lot to unpack in our conversation today. And digging into other challenges, the second most frequent challenge that foundation leaders report is deciding whether and how to engage in policy. They mention the difficulty of balancing competing priorities and feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of challenges that they seek to address. And the third most frequent challenge that foundation leaders report is just building an understanding of the policy sphere. That includes things like staying current on the policy context, understanding various stakeholder perspectives, and as well as having a sense that they may not have the staff capacity that they need to engage in policy. And even as most leaders, as we just saw on the previous slide, say that they have a strong understanding of the legally permissible policy activities the foundation can engage in, a good number still describe those laws as pretty murky. So how can funders mitigate against these challenges? We'll certainly be discussing this, but I want to share some of the insights from foundation leaders that are doing a lot of policy work and some of the tangible suggestions and tips that they offer. They suggest remembering that policy is just one tool, a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. They also emphasize how funders can start where it makes sense, start small. And they offer reminders that funders don't need to do this work alone. They can support grantees' existing policy efforts, collaborate with other funders, and also turn to philanthropy-serving organizations like regional associations and issue-based affinity groups as resources for learning about and getting engaged in policy work. So this wraps up the high-level review of the data. In addition to surfacing current practices and perspectives, and especially in light of the current moment, we at CEP hope that these findings spur foundation leaders to candidly discuss how policy relates to their work. So speaking of which, Anne, Don, and Ivy, why don't you join me on video to kick off this discussion?
Hi there, everyone. Ivy and Don are joining us. Here we are. Thank you so much, Naomi, and thanks to the entire CEP team for the invitation to co-host this session with you today, and to our two fantastic panelists, Don Chen and Ivy Allen, and to all of you for joining us. I, for one, am really excited to be a part of this conversation, which for me centers on the understanding that public policy change and the advocacy efforts that lead to it are an incredibly powerful lever for impact. The impact that can be achieved via public policy change can be truly transformative, both in its scale and its longevity, which is why it is really exciting to see more and more foundations engaging and investing in advocacy and public policy change, and why, at least from my perspective, it's important for more foundation leaders and boards to think about how an advocacy strategy could augment and really accelerate the way that they are having an impact on their philanthropic goals and priorities. At BoardSource, we have been working since 2014 to increase board level understanding of advocacy as a tool for greater impact through a collaborative campaign called Stand for Your Mission. The rationale for this focused initiative is really reinforced by the findings from this recent CEP research. Boards play a critical role in unlocking an institution's advocacy potential. Within the boardrooms of both foundations and non-grant making nonprofits, decisions are being made that can propel an organization's advocacy work forward or stop it dead in its tracks. That's why BoardSource has been so vocal about the transformative potential for advocacy, because we know that boards hold the keys to whether or not the social sector will use its voice, its influence, and really its power to advance change. And it's why I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation today with two foundation leaders who are, through their leadership partnerships with their boards, positioning their institutions to create real and lasting change through advocacy and public policy. Don and Ivy, thank you so much for the work that you do and for your willingness to be a part of today's conversation. I'd love to just kick us off by inviting each of you to share a really quick summary of just how your foundations think about advocacy as a means by which you do your work to achieve philanthropic goals, just as a way to center our conversation in a way that acknowledges who you are as an institution. Don, would you be willing to share first?
Yes, I'm delighted to be here, and I just want to thank you, Anne, for leading us and for BoardSource's work. And I also want to commend CEP for a terrific report and Naomi's report out from that. And just great to be with Ivy on this panel. So I'll just tell you a little bit of history about the Cerna Foundation. We have been focused on policy change ever since we hired professional staff back in the 1980s. It was done with the recognition that in order to really foster systems change, durable social change, we needed to focus on policy. And so from the get-go, as soon as there were staff members at the Cerna Foundation, we focused on a number of areas like comprehensive community development, sustainable forestry practices, transportation policy reform. And we took that really seriously, again, to achieve that really durable, sustainable change, and recognized along the way that policy change, policy work, advocacy comes in many forms, from organizing to coalition building, to research and communications, a wide variety of different types of advocacy that can all, of activities that can all contribute to policy change. Today, 30 years later, or I guess it's about 30 years or so, the Cerna Foundation is still focused on that basic approach, addressing root causes, systems change, and we have since really refined our mission to focus on social justice and to put racial justice at the center of our mission. And so I guess the last thing I'll leave this part of the conversation with is that today, ever since George Floyd was murdered, we have seen a tremendous number and an increasing array of people calling for change, and not just the type of change in criminal justice and policing, but really systemic change to address systemic racism, structural racism, and to all of us, or many of us, we understand that those changes, a huge part of that change will require changes in policy, because a lot of what has gotten us here, if not the vast majority of what has gotten us here, has been a series of policy changes over centuries. And to get us out, we also need to focus on policy change to dismantle those previous decisions that have really created those racial disparities. So I'll leave it there, and happy to continue that part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Ivy, would you mind orienting us a bit to how you think about advocacy and public policy change at the Foundation for the Mid-South?
The Foundation for the Mid-South, quite frankly, was founded by business and civic leaders. William Winter, former governor of Mississippi, was one of our founders. And so we've always had an understanding and recognition that policy plays a great role in it. But how do you bring those factors and those individuals and institutions together to really try to address the issue? So never been outwardly policy focused for folks who would sit and say, you have a former governor and you've had other particular civic leaders on before on our boards. But in general, we were founded with that premise of, we were founded to cover Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And so, and also at that time, we had 3 Democratic governors, Bill Clinton, Ray Davis, and Buddy Roemer. And so those were also 3 native sons of the South, but also folks who went to school in the North and came back home to serve in that capacity. So in addition to our founders, William Winter, we also had those 3 governors who also said, when you look at many of the indicators, we race to the bottom. So instead of us only trying to compete Arkansas with Louisiana, Louisiana with Arkansas, Louisiana with Mississippi, why not join an entity, create an entity at which we can try to move the region as opposed to moving the individual? And so that was the basis for it. And as I said, we had all of those, particularly governmental representatives, as a part of it. And so it's always been a part, but separate. And from that lens, and not really having heavy voices from the government side so that people wouldn't question what our purpose was. But we recognize that in this area in particular, resources alone will not do it. And so all the money in the world, if we don't change the policies and practices, that's what will move our people.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on one of the things that I'm hearing from both of you, which is how much your context informs your strategy as it relates to advocacy. Your institutional history, your philanthropic goals, where you operate in terms of place, which I think goes to the idea that advocacy is just not a one-size-fits-all strategy. There's not one way to do it, and it's going to look different depending on what a foundation is seeking to accomplish, where and how it operates, and the way that it thinks about its role. And that, I think, of course, informs the way that boards think about the legal parameters as it relates to advocacy and their overall support of advocacy efforts, which we saw in the CEP data, are both pretty significant board level barriers. It seems that for some boards and board members, there's skepticism that any role in advocacy is legal or appropriate. And then other boards are really thinking about advocacy as a central part of the foundation's strategy and working to understand how to legally access all of the advocacy muscle that they possibly can. And then I think sometimes, and this may be part of what we're seeing, underneath those data, that board and staff can be in different places, with staff in one of those kind of categories and board in another. So I'm curious, just as a sort of entry point to conversation and dialogue about board change, what advice do you have to foundation presidents who are really making the case for advocacy to their boards, whether their boards are trying to get comfortable with the idea of advocacy, or if they might be in a place where they're thinking about how to push the boundaries of what more they can do? Who wants to go first?
I'll start. I think it's one of those things where we took a lot of time, particularly when I came on board, to actually set the parameters for what terms mean. Because some folks, advocacy means being out, being visible, and having a crowd to assist you. And for others, is how do we use our words, our knowledge to influence folks. And so I think the clear thing for folks who want to do it is be clear about what's the way that you feel you can be most effective. I would sit and say for us, our most effective way is probably talking to policymakers directly. Do we not support groups and some of our grantees who are probably more vocal? Yes. But for us, we try both approaches, obviously. But I think that being able to be in an environment where we're able to have good, lengthy conversations with policymakers, and that's how they get to better understand our lens, and we get to better understand their lens. Because oftentimes in these conversations, they will sit and say, we believe in what you say. I've got to convince some of my fellow policymakers. And here are the things that you can do to assist us in that process. And so the dialogue, and not having it as an us versus them, but how do we work in partnership to really try to let's stay focused on the ultimate outcome is the betterment for our people in being able to do it. And so looking at various approaches and what works best to get the end result that we all want.
I'll tackle that set of questions by highlighting a few examples. I think that we, over the decades, have really taken pains to understand the many different ways in which change occurs. And if you look at the different topics that the Certain Foundation addresses today, we have had a long-standing focus on environmental issues. Today, it's very much focused on climate justice, recognizing that those communities of color, low-income communities, typically are in a position to be affected the first and the worst because of climate changes, all the disruption that we expect to occur. And so one thing that has been relatively new and also took some education and engagement with the board is that we decided to really focus on making sure those communities that will be affected first and worst have a very strong voice in decision making, and that we really try to lean towards funding frontline organizations and leaders rather than the very well-funded major environmental groups, which are, of course, incredibly important. But frontline organizations, people of color-led organizations have for many decades been overlooked by philanthropy. And yet they're the ones who will be affected the most. And so that was a major shift. It's a different approach to advocacy because it means that we are supporting more organizing, more coalition building at the local level, so that those voices can not only represent that community expertise, the tremendous amount of knowledge that community members have about potential solutions and the problems, but also really ensure that those communities are part of the democratic decision-making process, which is one of our core values in America. So that's just an example of how our work on advocacy within the environmental and now climate justice context has changed. Another example would be the way in which we work in places. We are a foundation that is devoted to fostering sustainable and just communities, although we are quick to say that we're not necessarily tied to a specific place because it's not in our founding documents to focus on a particular geography, but we have chosen to focus on a number of places because we see a synergy of opportunities to be able to make a difference in those areas. And so the post hurricanes Gulf Coast area was one place where we really focused, and that work was it was 8 years of relatively intense grant making and partnership, and we still have a lot of activity in New Orleans in particular, and to advance policy change, because we recognized one of the diagnoses of the challenges there was a very negative policy environment for communities of color, for low-income communities, and for the broader environmental health of the region to be better. So we spent a lot of time there recognizing that in order to make change in places, it's very relationship driven, and it's important to build not only those relationships, but also support among many different actors, whether it's private sector, public sector, nonprofits, educators, etc. And that takes time. It all contributes to the policymaking process, and it's really critical. So those are just a couple of examples that provide a little bit of context for how we've approached our policy work.
Thank you so much. You know, one of the things I'm hearing between and across both of your comments is how much really strategic advocacy and public policy work requires an understanding of your context and an understanding that that context shifts and changes, or that ecosystem shifts and changes over time, and being really thoughtful about how and where as a foundation you can do the most good, whether it's directly, as you were saying, Ivy, or thinking about ways or strategies or organizations that are under resourced, as you're sharing, Dawn, and that need to be a part of the conversation and that need financial support to bring their voice to policy solutions. I think one of the threads through that, at least as I'm hearing it, is public policy change and advocacy strategies need to be long-term in their focus, but flexible in terms of the incremental kind of actions or steps that are leveraged to move that forward. And so, that's a really different way of operating, at least for some foundations. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about, advice that you might have about, the pace of advocacy and public policy change and the overall timeline for progress.
Maybe I'll take this one first. So I would say, this goes to the third finding in the report, which I thought was just very insightful. Policy change is not a straight path. It's not easy. Otherwise, I think more people would be doing it. It tends to be, frustrating, and it requires a lot of dedication and, some trust building among funders, among grantees, and between them, and so forth. And so it's hard work, but at the same time, the rewards are great. I think our foundation really made that calculation years ago, again, because it really wanted to see some durable change. Also, the Sardina Foundation has taken a relatively long-term and patient approach to social change. We are a foundation that's been around over a century, and we're focused on really giving grantees a lot of latitude and multi-year support to try to basically unfetter them to be able to be creative and take advantage of opportunities and build their capacity and leadership and those types of things. So, but to get to your question here, I think, there are multiple policy campaigns, policy objectives that foundations may be interested in. And that's part of the effort on advocacy, because you do want to see policy change if you're supporting that type of work. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of value that is gained by simply funding the building of those new muscles, building of the relationships, the practices, the expertise, the understanding of how to work together in coalitions, understanding of how to influence the policymaking process, and all of that is really valuable. We refer to it, and I'm sure a lot of others refer to that as infrastructure building. We're building the infrastructure, again, relationships, expertise, so that that can be deployed when the moments of opportunities arise. And sometimes our grantees have been, well funded enough to create those moments of opportunity. They are really pushing for those changes, creating those openings, and sometimes they're responding to them. But the bottom line, if you're trying to create policy change, you have to be nimble, you have to be resourced to tackle those types of things. And for our board and other boards, one of the really critical things is just staying in frequent communication. As the report says, engage the board early and often. For us, I think the details of doing that are really important. In other words, if people have an aversion to the word political, it's very important to break down what that means. When you're talking about advocacy, are you talking about, policy idea development, which then maybe will be developed into something more concrete that's legislative, but is not necessarily funded by your foundation? Are you funding small p political? In other words, being savvy about reading the opportunity landscape so that you understand how the policymaking process works and how all of the other political processes influence that opportunity for change. So being very savvy about the political set of opportunities and the moments is really crucial to policy change, and just helping the board and your staff and other audiences understand exactly what your foundation is going to do and can do and what it can't do is very critical to kind of getting that comfort level to make decisions.
And I think I echo what he said about being clear about your capacities. And one of the things that we often have to do is, number one, in our area, our 3 states, number one, these are not full-time legislators. So they're in and they're out. And so they have a set amount of time in which they're there. So you always, at least from our lens, we have to work with the long view in mind, because you have a lot of education that you have to do. Quite frankly, a lot of these legislative bodies don't even have significant staff. And so sometimes our resources go to how do we provide them with the information and data that helps them effectively understand in order to even institute policies or procedures in that process. And so it takes a long time. And so I think we probably all say for the long haul, and that's true, but it probably means different things in different situations and being able to do it. But when you have folks who are in session, 90 days out of the year, they come in. And so during that downtime, we have to spend a lot of time trying to educate, bring nonprofit groups to the fold to be able to sit and tell their stories. And many of these folks are local, they go back home and they're in their local community, so they understand the situations in the first place. But the resources and the capacity to effectively do things in a very quick turnaround is a challenge. And a lot of that is just because there aren't real staff or heavily staffed in those various locations. And so a lot of our resources may go to also paying for the reports that basically give them the information that they need. And so it's really about how can we be most effective at helping them be as effective as they can be in their positions. And so paying for rallies or supporting some of our nonprofit groups to sit and be there, because they are the biggest voices in their respective communities anyway. And they know those legislators, and they're able to talk about the issues with them. And honestly, I would sit and say a lot of it is not trying to inform folks because they live it every day, but it's just helping them when they get together as a collective, figure out how we're not going to get everything we want, but what are the things we absolutely must have within that process. And so that's not us teaching, that's us being a partner as well within the process and saying, how can we, what can we get in round, as opposed to we have to have the ultimate right off the bat. And so, and that's a challenge sometimes for folks, but when you're in places where, depending upon what the issue is, we have a big hill to climb. And in that instance, it's about tempering expectations for being able to recognize when you've made a milestone that takes you to the next one.
Celebrating those incremental wins. Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
I think, part of the conversation here, I just want to, bring in and amplify some of the perspective of nonprofit leaders. The topic of providing flexible, continued long-term support is not a new topic in philanthropy. It's certainly gaining more traction now, but we asked about it specifically when we surveyed nonprofit leaders. And of course, as I shared, one of their top recommendations for how funders can be more effective in their policy work is provide this flexible support that helps nonprofits do this long, hard change that doesn't come overnight, and that also, especially in moments like these, helps them be nimble and pivot and react to the current moment in an effective way. Yet, there's a bit of an aspiration gap here that we see in the data. When we asked foundation leaders about the extent to which providing general operating support is important to their foundation strategy, less than 30% say that it's extremely important to provide grantees with general operating support for grantees' policy efforts. So I think I just want to bring in that point as an opportunity for funders to think about how they can more effectively support the work that their grantees are doing in service of durable systems change.
I'm so glad you raised that, Naomi. And, as I think about a moment like this one, and how as a social sector and as institutions and people who are committed to real systemic change and what we can do to make a difference that will hold and seize the awareness that is new for so many in this moment. It makes me think, really broadly and expansively about what can be possible, but also then really tactically about what does it take to be able to seize these moments. And to your language, Don, how do you make those investments in the relationship infrastructure so that when there is a window of opportunity, which is I hope what we are in right now, organizations, both philanthropic and non-grant making, can really leverage them. So beyond general operating support, which we know is so critically important, are there other tactical things that either you have done as an institution and that you would recommend to others that makes it more possible for moments to be seized and for progress to be made, even when it's not predictable?
Well, it's very timely for you to raise that question because since the pandemic started, we've seen a wave of foundations embracing trust-based philanthropy practices. And I know both of your organizations have really honed in on this, and it's exciting to see. And that generally means giving grantees more flexibility, more money, and fewer restrictions to do their work well. And one of the key things, of course, is to convert project support grants, which do have restrictions, to general support, which don't, and also to really ground the relationship more in a trusting relationship between funder and the grant recipients. And the key question for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other folks, is to what degree will those practices still continue after the pandemic is over? I think that one of the exciting things is that we have a trial period right now. We have a lot of funders who haven't been formally practicing those types of approaches now in the middle of it. And it's a great opportunity for learning, for analysis to really see how the grantees are doing and whether boards of foundations and staff people really see an opportunity to change the way they do it on a permanent basis. So to me, that's exciting, and I hope that does become more of a permanent feature of the work that we see. To your other question, Anne, about the balance between long-term capacity building so that organizations can be nimble and at the same time trying to respond to unexpected opportunities, I think that's always a tension. I think what we've seen, and this is certainly true of CERDNA, is that when there are really major unexpected challenges or opportunities, a lot of foundations really should try to be responsive. even though a lot of us are not set up to act that way. But the great thing is that we've seen a lot of foundations, again, since the COVID-19 pandemic and also the police killing of George Floyd, a lot of foundations are going to their boards, and boards are basically stepping up the grant making because they recognize the windows of opportunity and also the challenges. And so, for us, it was just one example would be how the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program at the federal level, was implemented. We didn't get involved in the legislative part of it because we don't do that, but we saw that here's this giant, gazillion-dollar program that was really poorly being executed, and a lot of small businesses, especially those owned by people of color, by people of color entrepreneurs, were not getting the federal benefits that a lot of larger corporations were getting. And so shining a light on that from a research standpoint, calling on advocacy to make sure that that program is implemented properly, that was a totally unexpected thing, but we saw the need to really respond to that and resource our grantees to be part of that debate.
Thank you so much. We're going to move to questions, but Ivy, before we do that, anything you'd add just in terms of tactical advice that can be done to create more flexibility and in windows of opportunity?
One of the things that we do, we don't even consider ourselves a funder. We consider ourselves a partner. So we are at the table with them from the very beginning. So it's not just about resources or even financial resources that we bring, but what's the issue and who are the other folks that we can bring to the table. Sometimes it's just how do we get the public actors to come in to really hear this. And so sometimes that's our role at being the operator between those two and bringing those two together. So we host small lunches in our offices where the nonprofits will have the opportunity to sit and tell the legislators what's going on and what their needs are and get people to sit and see it differently. So we really don't look at ourselves, although we are a funder, but really because of where we are and the resources, we have to work smart and hard in many ways. And so for us, we are partners in this process. We're partners with the legislators to sit in, because they sit and say they don't hear the challenges we have, but we also partners with the community to sit and hear their piece, which is they're not doing enough when it's really getting them in the table. And it's been interesting sometimes to have both groups together. We don't do it at big settings, but really how do we bring select folks in to kind of sit in dialogue to better understand the process. And I think that helps, because particularly for the nonprofit organizations, they are the voices of their respective communities. And they can go back and say, he's not as bad as I thought he was, or she's not as bad. It's just now I better understand the system. And so, and in our area also, people are not full-time legislators. And so they have their day jobs within that process. And so within that truncated period of time, how do we begin to have that dialogue? And it may not even get through that session, but how do you begin to have it to where you now know what to do? So in that next session, next time, you're able to fully basically present it and hope to get it approved, but also it gives those legislators an opportunity to basically lobby their partners because they better understand as well. And so being in a small place, sometimes you don't have the resources when it comes to money, but how do you use other ways to really be influential and bring about that change?
I love
and
that
on
framing.
that note,
yeah. Go ahead, Naomi.
I did it again to you, Anne. On that note, right, Ivy, your point about collaboration and to your question, Anne, about some tactical suggestions, I think, one thing that came through loud and clear in the study is that funders don't need to be doing this work alone, right? And especially when it comes to the big systems changes that our funders are trying to change, they can't actually do this alone. And so I just want to underline the importance here of collaboration, of looking to support the work that your grantees are likely already doing in the policy realm, thinking through how you can get engaged with issue-based affinity groups, or other regional associations, other philanthropy serving organizations that have expertise in the policy realm, that can connect funders to others doing policy work, and especially for funders, right, who don't necessarily have the staff with policy expertise. This is a great way to get involved and work in coalition with others. And, you know, the other tactical suggestion that I wanted to share, again, channeling the interview data collection we did, is a good number of funders, both to build board support for their policy work, and also to help connect the dots between the policy implications that connect to their grant making program areas, was to get proximate, right? They brought in their grantees to the boardroom. They, you know, one example that sticks out to me from an interview I conducted is funders that were doing grassroots organizing brought in those organizers to talk to their board about the importance of policy change, so that the board was hearing, you know, more directly from folks on the ground about the importance of this work. And also, you know, this also connects to building a broader board understanding and board support, is thinking about where foundations can bring in experts to help orient the board and build comfort levels for legally permissible policy activities, right? The report that we put out includes a number of really great resources from other organizations that can help funders. So some that come to mind are, you know, Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy does a lot of training. Learn Foundation Law has a great module for program staff at foundations about differentiating between advocacy and lobbying. United Philanthropy Forum, the Council on Foundations, NCRP. There's so many great resources that foundations can look to get smarter about this work, especially the legally permissible activities.
Yeah, and we're getting actually a number of questions about that. So for those who are asking, how can we help educate our board and staff about what's legally permissible? To what degree are foundations able to directly fund lobbying by their grantees without jeopardizing their own tax-exempt status? These resources that Naomi is highlighting are great resources. And just to name Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy Program, they have a direct technical support line that you can access as a foundation. So even if you have really specific questions, they're a great resource there. So sort of piggybacking on that, and this can be a kind of a quick popcorn, we have a question that's asking, how often are you intentionally doing general operating support grants as a method for supporting lobbying as advocated by the Alliance for Justice? Anybody want to jump in there?
We provide general operating support mainly because we support the entire mission and operations of the organization. And in some cases, we know, you know, nonprofits can do a certain amount of lobbying. I was a grant seeker for a long time, and that's something that I was very aware of as a grant seeker. So, you know, it's I would say, yeah, our first thought is not to, you know, provide general support because an organization can do lobbying. It's much more about, you know, do we just see them as part of a core part of the work that we're funding overall, and they may do some lobbying because that's what organizations do. So that's the approach that we tend to take with it. And I think about half of our grantees are general support. Another chunk is, you know, sponsored organization, fiscally sponsored organizations that might be kind of general within those sponsorships.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there. One of the other things that we hear a lot from nonprofits, simple tactical things that foundations can do that can be help support advocacy, is not having things in your grant agreements that scare them into thinking that you don't want them to do advocacy. So I would compare that whether you're talking about general operating support or you're talking about your grant agreements or you're talking about both. Don't give a grantee a toolbox and say you can use everything except this hammer and I'm taking that out. You know, think about how you can say we trust you to advance what we both care about in the best way that you see fit.
Very good point.
So I think we probably need to not go into big complicated questions that we haven't touched on, but we have one question that I think speaks to some of what we've been talking about in terms of long-term commitment and being responsive and opportunistic. And the question is, how do you operationalize a balance between being responsive to policy opportunities and being strategic about your own policy priorities? So if one or both of you can speak to that really quickly, and then we do unfortunately need to move to wrap up.
For us, we do have policy priorities, but I will sit and say for the most part, particularly with many of our grantees, we all have the same agenda. And it's not about those are the groups we choose to work with, but the issues that we are trying to address are pretty predominant, and those are the issues that most of us are trying to address, maybe with different leans and with different expectations of what aspect of it they want to have occur. But for the most part, we're all, you know, pretty much driving towards the same set of goals and objectives. Ours may be sometimes much more metrics driven, and theirs may be much more, we care about the people. But once we can get past those types of conversations, we discover quite often we have the same goals. For us, it may be numbers. For them, they want to help the people, and we strike the balance of how do we come up with the right numbers to know that you are making a difference in the process. And so it's about working with your grantees, working on the language, and also listening to sit and hear what they're saying and realizing that oftentimes you're not that far apart on those goals and expectations. Sometimes it's just the language that we're using. And if you bring in the outside evaluators, they talk in a very different language than for community-based folks who are like, look, I'm out here trying to do the work. And so it's also helping them understand you may be trying to do the work, but you got to help us understand what's happening with the work. And so it's being able to be a bridge and a communicator with folks. And we don't want you to be scared and sit and say, I'll never get a grant. But we also want you to be able to help tell your story, because that's how we can also help other folks come to the fold to assist you if you're able to talk about what you're doing, not about the money, but what you're doing and how you're doing it with what you have.
So another argument for really deep relationship and understanding and partnership, as I'm hearing it, between grantees and funders, even if you think of your role as partner, so that you have that understanding of shared goals. That's great advice. We are unfortunately out of time. We could talk for another, I'm sure, hour, and I so appreciate this conversation. Ivy, Don, thank you so much for sharing this time with us, for sharing your stories. Naomi, thank you for the work that you do at CEP that brings so much important data and context to this conversation. Thanks to you all for being with us and for the important work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.